Joey knew he had to follow the captain's orders, so that's exactly what he was going to do. He went back to his room, stripped down, and began to get rid of the fur that she hated so much. Immediately, he pulled out a set of clippers and began to cut all the hair off the top of his head, leaving a little bit. I mean, he is human after all, basically giving himself a buzz cut, though most Xenos wouldn't even know what the hell that is. All he knew was that they did not enjoy the long hair unless they were a mammalian species, which the captain, of course, was not. After that, he pulled out his razor, which happened to be laser shears, and began to start taking the face fuzz off. This took a little bit longer than he thought, as the hair itself had gotten coarse, brittle, and difficult even for the shears to take off. However, eventually it did, and he could see that clean-shaven look that he had before when he first walked in. Once he got done with the face, he worked his way down, down to make sure that she was not disgusted and end up giving him a bad review. The last thing he needed was her putting anything on paper that made him look bad, all things considered. Once he was done with all the fur taken off, he began to hydrate himself. He was still feeling the effects of all that sleep after all that work, and nothing helps deal with that faster than hydrating, just like dealing with a hangover. He then pulled out a small plastic container, very small, just holding a few ounces of fluid, pulled open the lid, went to go put it to his face, and he hesitated, sitting there, making a small noise. Ugh. He put it to his lips and flipped it upside down. All 5.7 ounces of fluid went down his throat as he tried to put it down as fast as possible. Once it was done, he threw the container straight to the floor and desperately tried not to explosively vomit from the chemicals that he had just put into his system. He dropped to his knees for a moment, desperately trying to keep his insides from becoming his outsides. He then went and drank even more water, trying to get any type of mass into his body. He knew he needed this to get through the effects of what had just happened. The moment he was able to stand again, he reached up and began brushing his teeth again, scrubbing his tongue drastically, and eventually, after a few minutes, spitting everything out and saying, "God, I really hate that stuff." Eventually, he got himself ready and was on his way to the captain's quarters. Beforehand, he turned down to the galley to grab himself a snack. He needed this, as his stomach was having issues at that point from what he had taken before. The snack turned out to be a small meal, though small to him was about average for everyone else, mainly focusing on high proteins and irons and loaded with as many vitamins as he could get his grubby little mitts on. From the time he walked into the galley, to when he was eating, to even when he left, he had to ignore all the comments and stares that were coming off. Many of the crew barely recognized him now that he had gotten rid of all the face fuzz and trimmed all the hair on his head down to barely a quarter-inch. They were surprised at this. Many of them enjoyed the new look. Others were more, well, they weren't nice about it, as they preferred to have a face full of hair, as this was the way their species males usually were. Yet they still looked up and down at him and thought, well, he is a male after all, and he's going to see the captain. With this, immediately he got up and left. Arriving at the captain's quarters, he knocked on the door, but nothing happened. He was surprised. He still had to catch his breath as he was running over, but then he was just put back at the fact that there was no answer. He knocked again, but this time harder. He didn't hear anything from the inside. He even called out to the captain, saying that he was there, but then thought maybe she's not in right now. He turned to leave, and then he heard the door slide open. He turned back around and peered in, and there was the captain. She was holding a towel in front of her, trying desperately to dry herself off. She had clearly just come out of the shower herself, and tells Joey to come in as quick as possible. She then reached out, basically grabbed him, and yanked him inside. Once the door shut, she was turning towards Joey and seemed to be embarrassed at the idea that she had been exposed to him. Her normal attire didn't cover much in the eyes of humans. In fact, it was barely much more than what they would consider a one-piece swimsuit. However, for her to be totally exposed like that was something she was not used to. She looked away and again wrapped her tail around her leg, a clear sign that she was embarrassed. Yet Joey seemed to chuckle at this. This, of course, agitated the captain to no end. And Joey comments how women are universally shy in this regard. This surprised the captain, as normally Joey didn't talk much about humans. Hell, he didn't talk much at all. She then asked about those females in humanity that are higher on the social order. Aren't they more exposing themselves? Joey was having trouble not laughing at her screwing up her words, as this is the first time the translator wasn't able to keep up. But then again, maybe she wasn't able to keep up at all. She was not exactly thrilled about this whole situation, but she couldn't exactly deny it either. She continued on as she talked about how the only time she had seen human females, they were wearing even less than what her species does, and they had certain reputations. Joey answered about females that are not conservative in such things, especially in public areas, get attention for sure, but socially, as far as males are concerned, they're at the bottom of the barrel in the regards to any real men. The captain was suddenly perking up. Real men? She didn't understand it. Joey responded with, "Yet real men are not slaves to their base desires. They get on their grind, their job, their focus, their purpose, and they just keep going. They don't sit there and stop every time they get, excited." The captain was puzzled. "Is this why you stayed away from the crew?" Joey shied away a little bit and said, "Yeah, there are a lot more reasons to this, but primarily, yes." The captain was a bit confused, and as the realization of everything rushed over her, and she started to take stock of what was going on, she suddenly realized that she had started to lower her towel, exposing even more of herself, and immediately covered herself up. And then, shyly, keeping her eyes away, stated, "Before we begin, understand this is only due to biology. I can't help this. I can't stop this." Joey, reaching up and putting a hand on her shoulder, got a little close and said, "I get it. I get it. No emotion. Just biology. Just lust taking over." Yes, but in my position as a captain, Raising her head with his other hand, he looked deep into her eyes, which was slightly difficult considering the curvature of her face. He stated, "You don't have to worry about them. Not your position. Not now. Everybody understands. The only positions right now you need to even think about is the ones that we are going to do to satiate your biological needs. And if it just happens that you enjoy yourself a little too much, what's the problem?" Joey then began to pull her close, and the captain dropped the towel, fully exposing herself, but not that she ever gave a shit at this point. She then wrapped her arms around his torso, and her tail wrapped around his midsection. He knows this is a sign from her species of true intimacy. He wasn't going to push her back at all. She then opened his coveralls to find nothing. No clothes, no fur, which she knew he had plenty of. She examined with her clawed hands and then pushed the coveralls off his shoulders, dropping it to the ground. She then examined him, rubbed her hands around, not only to explore, but to caress as her internal systems began to turn on in high gear. She then reached up and licked from the center of his chest all the way up his neck. Joey understood this, as it was again part of her culture. She then begins to shake as though the anticipation is making things even worse. She stated, Humans have a reputation. She began to look him up and down and gave her version of a grin. Joey himself standing there, lean and fit, as though all his muscles had been tightened up for some reason. For some reason, none of his fat was still there. He hadn't had enough time to put any fat reserves on. She then looks closer and says, "Let's see if you can live up to another one of your reputations." 58 hours later, Joey is leaving the captain's quarters, basically pushing himself against the bulkhead as he's barely able to get his legs to operate correctly. Leaving, he looks back and he gives a bit of a grin at what he sees. He sees the room torn almost asunder. Though things are not actually damaged, everything is pushed all over, which was a complete switch over from what he had come in with. Inside the room, when he walked in, everything was well organized, as though somebody with OCD had designed the whole place. But now it looked like somebody had just thrown a couple of grenades in, ducked, and waited for the chaos to die down. The oddly durable bed was torn up pretty good. Not totally destroyed, but it was clear that claw marks were in the side. The sheets, at least one of them, was on the ground in several pieces. In the circular bed that was actually shaped more like a nest, which honestly drove Joey absolutely bonkers because the angles were just absolutely wrong. She slept inside. She was sprawled out inside the bed, which was not normal for her species. Normally they curl up, they don't spread out. He could see part of her body. He left it there as kind of a mental image he wanted to hold on to, as he realized how fun it was, even though he wasn't exactly feeling all that great. Most of the bottom half of her body, to include her tail, was covered with the warming blanket. Warming blankets, of course, needed because her species was primarily cold-blooded, and they didn't need it beforehand. But now that she's asleep, the last thing they need is her to go into a coma. Going down the hall, everyone would think Joey would head straight to the galley to get as much food as possible, but instead, he headed to the infirmary, and for good reason. As he walked in, the doc thought he was going to pass out as he was completely pale and having trouble walking. She immediately ran over, using her many appendages to walk him to the table and place him on it. The aquatic species of the doc was able to have multiple appendages, some of them like tentacles coming out of her back and sides, which definitely helped do her job, as she didn't have to pull focus from anything else, as her tentacles could reach over and grab whatever she needed and bring it to her. She reached up and opened his coveralls, and she could see multiple lacerations as she pulled it down. Mainly, they were across his back, from his neck all the way down to his mid-thighs. This made it so that sitting on the table was not exactly comfortable. There was also a lot of dark bruising, mainly around the midsection. It was pretty obvious what had happened. As she looked, she could see bruising around the arms, legs, and neck. Doc asked before they started, "Is there anything that needs special care?" Joey reaches up towards his neck and rubbed his shoulders a little bit, as the doc saw a little bit of discoloration around the neck as well. "No," which is surprising. Doc asked, "How so is this?" Joey, continuing to rub and reaching back towards his shoulders, said a few times, "I thought she was going to kill me." The doc seemed to giggle at this as she realized that the bruises were from the captain's tail. The tails are almost 100% muscle, which meant they have a hell of a lot of squeezing power. It doesn't take long to patch him up. In fact, just going over his back with a dermal repair kit was enough to get him fixed up in less than a minute. Most of the bruising would go away over time anyway, so it wasn't something they had to worry about. She brought over the scanner to make sure there was no internal damage, of course. Though before any of that even started, she had started a nutrient drip that went into his arm. In fact, the bag hung there, and Joey reached down and actually opened it up as high as it would go, as he was completely drained of anything. As the nutrients began to flood his body, Joey began to feel better and simply stated, "Whew, boy, at least she should be taken care of until her next cycle, which should be next year, I think." The doc actually paused. "What? Didn't you know?" With that, Joey was immediately focusing on her words. "Her species mating cycle lasts at least another 5 days minimum." Oh, shit. Joey didn't even have time to think about this, as a call over the PA system came in telling Joey to return to his previous location of duty immediately. Captain's orders. Joey, without hesitation, didn't even look up as he reached up with his arm, grabbed the bag full of nutrients, and began to squeeze it as tight as he could. This was forcing all the cool liquid into his arm so fast that the doc thought he would be suffering from hypothermia, at least for a moment, until she remembered that humans are homeothermic. They don't need to worry about that. With a little bit of sympathy in her voice, the doc offered to override the captain's order due to medical concerns. As when it comes to anything medical, she overrides everyone on the ship. Joey simply shakes his head, holds his hand up, and refuses. He then realizes that the bag was almost completely empty anyway, and pulls out the needle from his arm. He jumps up and tries to zip up his coveralls, but has to pause for a second as something is now in the way. The doc was trying not to overly notice, as Joey immediately zipped up, thanked Doc, and began to head back out, although it was noticeable by everyone that he was going to pass that his own biological needs were causing a reaction. After Joey left, the doc could hear him running down the hallway. The doc quietly said to herself, "Well, humans do have a reputation after all."